on the cracked pavement of a crowded city street, where the world rushed past without stopping, an act so small it could almost be missed was about to unfold. Among shouting vendors, honking car horns, and the shuffle of hurried shoes, a little girl sat quietly with something priceless in her hands, a piece of bread. Her name was Aminata. She was young, far too young to know hunger as her oldest companion. Yet there she was, an orphan whose life had been stripped down to ragged clothes, a thin cloth sack, and her own resilience. That single piece of bread was everything to her. It was survival for that evening, a crumb of comfort for a child who had already learned too early that life does not wait for the weak. And just as she brought it closer, ready to eat, a shadow loomed. An old beggar shuffled into view. His beard was long and matted, his tunic little more than a tattered rag. He stopped in front of her, and with a voice cracked by age and sorrow, whispered, "Child, could you give me a bite?" Hunger lived in Aminata's stomach like fire. Her ribs pressed against her skin beneath the worn shirt, and yet she didn't pause. She broke the bread without hesitation and placed part into his trembling hands. "I know what it feels like to be hungry, Grandpa," she murmured, her voice soft like a prayer. What she didn't know was that this man was not always a beggar. His name was Buba. Once, he had been a man of wealth, a cocoa merchant who commanded respect. In his youth, his strong hands had clasped contracts and guided wagons filled with harvests. He had known the comfort of a home, the warmth of a wife, the strength of family, but the years had stolen it one piece at a time. His wife's death had been the first stone to crumble. His only son, once adored, sought riches and pushed his father aside, ashamed of the old man's simplicity. Betrayal had cut deeper than loss, leaving Buba wandering streets hollow, stripped of everything, searching for something he could no longer name. So when he saw that little girl clutching bread, frail yet alive with stubborn will, his hardened heart faltered. Shame told him to walk away. He thought, "She probably has less than I do." But hunger, relentless as time, pressed him forward. When Aminata handed him the piece, his soul bent beneath the kindness. That bite of bread tasted different than anything his tongue had known in years, not because of the food, but because of the spirit inside it. This was not pity. This was not charity. It was compassion from someone who understood pain because she lived in it herself. Her thin hands gave without calculation, with a generosity that could only grow from suffering. Aminata had not been born to the streets. She had once known the softness of her mother's lap, the simple laughter of a home. But her mother, Marama, had died far too soon, gone with her labor-worn hands still smelling of laundry soaps from endless days washing for wealthy families. On her deathbed, she had given Aminata one gift that remained unbroken, her words, "My child, even when you have nothing, never let your heart run out of kindness." Those words became the girl's anchor when everything else crumbled. Her father, undone by grief, found solace only in drink. Then came disappearance, no farewell, no explanations. Some whispered he went to the countryside. Others said he had found another family. But Aminata knew only the ache of abandonment. From a modest room, she was cast to cobblestones. From a warm embrace, she was left with only her shivering body tucked against freezing walls. Yet through it all, Aminata carried a surprising spark. Not the wide grin of a carefree child, but the small, stubborn smile of a flame refusing to be crushed by the storm. When people dropped coins or fruit into her hand, she thanked them with a look so sincere it unsettled them. A look that seemed to say she expected nothing from the world, but was grateful for the fragments it gave. At dawn, she wandered barefoot with her cloth sack, collecting tiny crumbs of survival. Some drivers scowled at her, begging at red lights, quickly rolling their windows. Others, when they did spare a coin, saw her bow her head once in thanks before she walked away. She never lingered or pleaded for more. Pride, inherited from her mother, marked the invisible line she never crossed. To ask was necessity. To beg without dignity? Never. At night she curled in corners of markets, in front of locked shops. She hugged her sack like treasure, listening as hunger gnawed louder than the city's noises. Still, if younger children followed her, or hungry dogs circled near, she broke her crumbs to share. "If I have a piece," she often whispered to herself, "I can't eat it all alone." So when Buba extended his hand, she gave freely, as instinct, and that small act set two lives onto a new crossroad. Buba chewed, tears pressing at eyes that had long dried. In Aminata he saw reflection, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the inner strength. He had known luxury, but hadn't felt warmth like this in decades. She was young and still carried the faint spark of hope. He was old and thought his flame long dead, yet her gesture rekindled a quiet faith in him. Faith that kindness still existed in the world. The two sat side by side on the rough sidewalk. Two forgotten figures among rushing footsteps. People hurried past, not seeing, or choosing not to. But fate had written their meeting in invisible ink, placing them together in a moment no one else knew was sacred. For a while, silence held them. It wasn't empty silence, but one filled with recognition. Two broken souls who, without words, admitted they understood each other. When the sun climbed higher, Booba rose slowly on shaking knees. He wanted to thank her, to speak. But the words tangled in his throat, too heavy with emotion. Instead, he placed a trembling hand on her head, a silent blessing. Aminata looked up and smiled, small, tired, yet radiant. That smile carried more warmth than all the fires he had ever known in his grand houses. He walked away with weary steps, but his spirit was lighter, a touch less broken. She returned to her corner with her half belly, yet her soul still carrying her mother's treasure. Never let your heart run empty. For in that shared piece of bread, there was more than just food. There was an invisible pact between two broken lives. The promise that even in misery, dignity and kindness could still bloom. Bubber didn't know it yet, but that gesture would be the thread that would pull him back to a forgotten past and lead him to an unexpected future. And Aminata, without realizing it, had just touched the heart of a man who carried a secret far greater than she could ever imagine. The people who passed by Bua every day in the square or along the narrow market streets saw nothing more than an old beggar, a body bent by time and misery. Too many he was just part of the scenery, a forgotten figure among fruit stands and peeling buildings. Some even pulled their daughters away as if he were a threat or a bad omen. But what no one knew was that behind those rags was a man who had once been respected, feared, and even envied. In his younger days, Buba was known as Buba Main, one of the most prosperous merchants in the region. His life had started humbly selling small bags of peanuts at the port of Bizao. He worked from sunrise to sunset, hauling heavy sacks on his back until he managed to buy his first batch of cocoa. From there, he built a fortune through honesty, courage, and vision. People remembered him walking tall in a light-colored suit, a well-aligned hat, and a firm voice that inspired trust in business. By his side was a woman named Enamara, his wife. It was with her that he shared dreams and the daily struggles. They had only one child, Lamine, to whom they gave everything they could. Booba would always say, "I don't want my son to go through what I went through. I want him to have education, respect, and a name." And so it was. Elman grew up surrounded by comfort, attending good schools, and receiving what many could never even imagine. But fate, as so often happens, came to collect its price. Enamara fell ill suddenly, a fever that wouldn't break, a body weakening by the day until death took her far too soon. Losing his wife was like a blow straight to Ba's heart. The man who once faced the world with confidence now walked unsteadily. Without her, the house felt empty, and business lost its meaning. He tried to recover, but grief turned his decisions into a string of failures. Little by little, his business began to fall apart. Poorly calculated investments, people he trusted who betrayed him. Debts multiplying like flames in dry straw. What had once been an empire became rubble from respected merchant. Bubber became just another man in free fall. And when bankruptcy finally hit, it was Layman, the beloved son, who dealt the cruelest blow. By then, a grown man, Lamine refused to stay by his father's side. He saw Boo's downfall as a disgrace, something that stained the family name. With what little money remained, Layman left for another city, married a wealthy woman, and never looked back. If someone asked about his father, he'd reply coldly, "He's not part of my life to boot." Each of those words was like a dagger. And so the once sprouted merchant lost everything: his wife, his son, his fortune, and his home. All that remained was his aging body and a heart heavy with regrets. He began wandering the streets, carrying in his wrinkles and in his eyes a story none knew. Those who saw him as a beggar could never have imagined that this man once sat at lavish tables, owned land, employed people, and was respected. That was Ba's secret. Behind the forgotten figure of an old man was a lifetime of glory and downfall. He spoke of it to no one. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of pain. But the truth was, despite all the misery he lived in, he still carried within him the memory of a man who had once been great. And it was that memory that resurfaced when Aminata shared her only bread with him. The girl's gesture reminded him of what dignity meant, of what it meant to be seen. Not for what you have, but for who you are. That night, as he lay on the cold ground, Booba closed his eyes and thought of the daughter he never had, the grandchild he'd never met. The family that had scattered like sand blown by the wind. But the image that stayed in his mind was that of the poor girl, in tattered clothes and kind eyes, breaking the bread and calling him Grandpa. For the first time in a long while, he felt he wasn't completely lost. There was still a flame of humanity alive in him, and that flame had come from a girl who had nothing, yet had given him everything in a simple act. The secret of his story remained hidden, invisible to the world. But his meeting with Aminata had begun to stir old wounds, and soon that forgotten past would rise to the surface, bringing revelations that would change the course of both their lives forever. In Aminata's life, each day was a new battle against hunger, cold, and loneliness. But what struck those who got close to her wasn't the misery she carried. It was the way she, even through suffering, managed to find strength to offer something to others. She lived like a loose leaf carried by the wind of the streets, but inside her was a heart that refused to harden. The harshness of her existence showed in every detail. Her frail body revealed sleepless nights, days without food, dawns spent under awnings trying to shelter from the dew. When it rained, cold water would run down her body and soak her thin, worn-out clothes. Yet she rarely cried because of it. She cried instead when she remembered her mother, when her stomach ached from emptiness, or when she saw families walking together and was reminded she had no one despite the hardship. Aminata hadn't become bitter. On the contrary, she held a sense of compassion that seemed to grow as life kept taking everything away from her. It was common for her to share a piece of fruit or bread given by a pass with another street child, even if that meant going hungry sooner. When someone asked why she did it, she would answer simply, "If I have something, I can't eat it alone. God sees me when I share." That habit wasn't just an act of spiritual survival. It was a reflection of the upbringing she'd received from her mother. Marama always said, "My daughter, life may steal almost everything from you, but don't ever let it steal your kindness. Whoever shares what little they have becomes rich in the heart." Aminata repeated those words in silence like a prayer to get through the hardest days, but the streets offered no mercy. Many times she was pushed aside by stronger kids, had her food snatched from her hands, or was chased away by shopkeepers. She had suffered humiliations from people who looked at her with disgust, as if poverty were a disease. Still, Aminata would pick herself up, wipe her tears, and keep going with that shy smile, that small gesture that seemed to say, "I still believe good exists." There were nights when the girl would sit alone at the edge of the square and watch Thessady lights. The glow of expensive restaurants, where families laughed and toasted, clashed with the emptiness in her stomach. But instead of envy, what she felt was a strange kind of calm. She would tell herself, "One day, maybe I'll find someone who truly sees me." That fragile hope was what kept her alive, like a flame fighting to stay lit in the wind. Her relationship with generosity was almost like a secret pact. It was as if she had decided that since the world gave her nothing, she would defy that fate by giving something to others. Often that decision seemed absurd to those watching. How could a starving girl share her only piece of bread? But Aminata knew deep in her heart that a shared piece of bread fed not just the other person's body, but also her own soul. Her meeting with Bua proved that. She didn't hesitate to give away half of what she had, even knowing she'd be left with less. By calling the old man Grandpa, she recognized in him someone who also carried pain, someone who didn't deserve to be treated as invisible. In that moment, she showed that her generosity wasn't charity. It was an acknowledgement of the other's dignity. It was as if she was saying, "You exist, and I see you." That way of seeing the world was what kept Aminata going. Even when the weight of poverty felt unbearable, she understood instinctively that her kindness was her true strength. While many lost their humanity in the face of poverty, she held on to hers, nurturing it like someone protecting a precious seed. And it was precisely that choice to live through generosity that began drawing something bigger toward Aminata, something far beyond anything she could imagine. The bread she shared with Bua wasn't just food. It was the invisible thread that would tie her destiny to that of a man marked by downfall. The girl who had nothing was about to transform lives using nothing but the quiet power of her kindness. While Aminata kept surviving with her stubborn kindness, old Ba battled a different kind of pain. The memory of his son, Lamine. There wasn't a single night he didn't think of him. The image of the little boy running around the yard, holding a wooden toy car his father had made with his own hands, came back to him like a ghost. He remembered how Lamin would smile whenever Ba returned from his travels, bringing candies wrapped in colorful paper. To Buba, that boy had been the greatest pride of his life. But the years passed, and the distance between them grew like a wall. Lamin was raised with every comfort: expensive schools, imported clothes, while his father drowned in debt and failed business ventures after the death of his wife. Ashamed of his father's downfall, Lamin pulled further and further away. When Boa finally lost his business for good, Lamin didn't just refuse to help. He cut all ties completely. He moved to a bigger city, married a rich businessman's daughter, and started a life of luxury. In society's eyes, Lamine was a success. He drove fancy cars, wore tailored suits, and threw parties in lavish mansions. To the media, he was a model of prosperity and business smarts. But behind that winner's image was a shadow, the rejection of the father who had given him everything, and who now wandered the streets. Lamin didn't want anyone to know about that connection. To him, old Booba was just a stain on his reputation. One day, one of Lamin's employees, while passing through the city, recognized the old beggar sitting near the market. He turned to the mansion and told his boss, thinking it might stir some sense of compassion. But Lamin's reaction was cold. He stood from his luxurious armchair with a look of disdain and said sharply, "That man is not my father. My father died a long time ago." Lamine's wife, a woman used to glamour and social status, noticed his discomfort and gently asked if it wasn't cruel to leave that old man out on the street. But Lamin, hardened, replied, "Don't talk to him about him. He ruined his own life and almost ruined mine. I fought to erase that stain. I want nothing to do with that burden." And so he ordered his staff that if they ever saw the old man again, they were not to bring him to him. He wanted to keep his father invisible, buried alive in forgetfulness. Ba, however, eventually heard about the rejection through whispers passed along by familiar faces. Someone mentioned that Lamin lived in wealth, surrounded by comfort, but didn't even want to hear his father's name. When Booba received this news, his heart broke even more. Not that he had expected a sudden reconciliation, but a part of him had still hoped that upon learning of his condition, his son would reach out. Instead, he was met with the cruelest rejection. Sitting on the cold ground in the square, Booba reflected on how bitter life could be. He had worked for so many years, sacrificing himself so that Lamin could have education, clothes, opportunities. He had given up his own dreams so that his son could have a better future. And now, that very son, having reached everything he'd ever wanted, discarded him like trash. That kind of rejection weighed just as heavily as hunger, because the hunger of the body can be satisfied with a piece of bread. But the hunger for love and respect eats away from the inside, and there's no easy cure for it. That's what befelt, an open wound that bled every time he remembered his son's ingratitude. In those moments, Ba found a kind of comfort in Am, the girl's simple kindness. The way she called him grandpa was like a balm. She who had nothing offered him more respect than his own son. And that comparison made Boa reflect even more deeply on the cruelty of life. How could a girl with nothing be more human than a man surrounded by wealth? There hadn't been a face-to-face encounter between father and son yet, but the rejection was already a towering wall. Lem preferred to remain higher atop his pride, looking down at his father, not realizing that his arrogance was pushing him away, not just from Booba, but from his own humanity. And so, while the son enjoyed the luxuries of life, the old man continued wandering, nourished only by a shared piece of bread and the bitter memory that his own blood now rejected him like a stranger. Fate, however, would not allow that wound to remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, their paths would cross again, and this time nothing would remain in the dark. The streets kept moving at their usual hurried pace, indifferent to the silent pain that lived within them. Among the shouts of street vendors and the noise of traffic, Aminata and old Boa crossed paths from time to time, always in moments of hunger and loneliness. It was as if an invisible thread connected them, pulling one toward the other when they needed it most. Each meeting may have seemed simple to the world, but within them it carried a deep meaning, an exchange far greater than scraps of bread. Booba, who had long lost faith in people, began to see in the girl something that rekindled a forgotten flame inside him. Aminata didn't treat him like a burden or as if he didn't exist. When she called him grandpa, he felt that he still mattered, that he was still someone worthy of affection. The way she shared the little she had, always with a timid yet sincere smile, reminded him of the kindness of his late wife, Infamara, and of the pure gaze of little Lamin back when his son was still a boy. In the girl's presence, it felt as though he was stepping back in time, as if he could glimpse all he had lost. One afternoon, under the blazing sun, Aminata found Boober sitting beneath a tree, his face worn and his body bent with exhaustion. He trembled with weakness and didn't even seem to have the strength to ask for help. The girl sat beside him, pulled a piece of boiled cassava from her cloth bag, a gift she had received earlier that morning, and handed it to him, saying simply, "Eat, Grandpa. I already had a bit. This is for you." Boer looked at her with tearful eyes. He knew that piece of food was all she had to get through the day, and yet she offered it without a second thought. He took it with trembling hands and whispered almost in tears, Why do you do this for me, child? You have so little. Aminata smiled gently and replied with quiet honesty. Because I know how it hurts to be hungry, and if I can share, I don't want to keep it all to myself. The answer pierced Booba's heart like an arrow. He who had once been a man of wealth had always believed that generosity came from abundance, but now, sitting before a girl with nothing, he discovered that true greatness doesn't lie in a full pocket, but in a heart willing to give. Over time, Booba began to look forward to his meetings with Amun. It wasn't just for the food she sometimes shared. It was for the warmth he felt in her presence. The girl spoke little, but every word carried a rare sincerity. And in her simple gestures, Booba found more dignity than in all the grand banquets he had once enjoyed in his rich days. It was as if fate had placed Aminata in his path to remind him that goodness still existed in the world. A small act, a piece of bread, a cassava shared, became something immense to that hardened old heart. Without even knowing it, the girl was saving what remained of Ba's soul. Meanwhile, Lamin's rejection echoed louder and louder in Bo's memory. But when he was next to Aminata, that pain seemed to fade. He would think, my own blood rejected me, but a girl with no connection to me calls me grandpa. And in that thought was a comfort no amount of wealth could ever buy. Act of kindness didn't just fill Booba's empty stomach. It gave him back something even more precious. The feeling of being seen, acknowledged, treated like a human being. It was a silent miracle happening in the middle of the city, unnoticed by most, but deeply understood by the two souls at its center. What Booba didn't yet know was that these small encounters were preparing his heart for the confrontation ahead. Fate would lead him back in front of his son, and when that moment came, the memories of rejection would mix with the strength of the girl's kindness. That mixture would have the power to change everything, and write a story that once seemed condemned to be forgotten. Time moved slowly for Bua, and each day on these streets seemed to weigh heavier on his shoulders. Yet deep in his heart, there was a persistent voice that wouldn't let him rest. The memory of Lem, the only son he had given everything to. As much as the rejection had wounded him, Hestel held on to the hope that somehow, someday, his son might open his heart. That hope, quiet but stubborn, was what pushed him forward, like an invisible force, urging him to take one final step toward the past. It was on a gray, overcast morning that Boa made his decision. He crossed the city slowly, leaning on a piece of wood he used as a cane. The journey to Lamin's mansion felt endless, but every step was driven by the memory of a little boy running into his arms, calling him Dad. That memory, still alive after all these years, was what gave him the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Lamin's mansion was imposing. Tall walls, a heavy iron gate, luxury cars parked out front. To a stranger, it was the picture of success. To Ba, it looked like a fortress, a wall separating him from his own blood. Standing at the gate, he took a deep breath and asked one of the security guards to let the owner know that his father was there. The guard looked him up and down with contempt. He saw only a ragged old man with a scruffy beard and tattered clothes. He scoffed and said, "The boss's father, I think you better move along, old man." But Booba stood his ground, with a firm voice. Despite his weakness, he replied, "Go and tell him, I am the father who gave him life." Reluctantly, the guard went inside. Minutes later, Lamin appeared. He was dressed in fine clothes, clean-shaven, his eyes cold. When he saw the old man, he frowned as if looking at a nuisance. There was no hug, no warm recognition, only the chill of distance. "What are you doing here?" Lamin asked, his voice dry. "Dot." Booba took a deep breath before answering. "I came to see you, son. I just wanted to look at you one more time." The silence that followed was heavy in the air. Lamin looked away, maybe out of shame, but quickly hardened again. "You had no reason to come here. The life you led was your choice. I'm not carrying your burden." The words hit Ba like stones. Still, he tried once more. "Son, yes, I made mistakes. I chose wrong. I lost everything. But everything I did to give you a future. I gave you the best of me. I didn't come here to ask for anything. I only came to be treated like a father, even if just for a moment." But Layman didn't waver. His eyes didn't shine with emotion, only with wounded pride. "I can't be associated with your shame. I have Anami, a position, respect. I won't let your misery stain what I've built." Those words cut through Ba's heart like blades. He stood in silence for a moment, staring at the son who now seemed like a stranger. In his mind, the image of little Lamin mixed with the cold man before him. "Dot last." Bubber spoke, voice trembling. "I gave you all I could, Lamin. But the only thing I needed most from you, I never received respect." He turned slowly, leaning on his cane, and began to walk away. The heavy silence in the courtyard was broken only by the sound of his dragging footsteps. Lamin stood still, his face rigid. but in the depth of his eyes, there was a shadow of doubt, as if those final words from his father were destined to echo within him. That day, the confrontation brought no reconciliation, only more pain, more distance, but it also left an invisible mark on Laman. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, his father's voice would repeat inside him night after night, reminding him that no amount of wealth or prestige could erase one truth. He had denied his own father the one thing he needed most for boot. The walk back to the streets was long and silent. There were no tears, only the weight of an old wound ripped open once more. Yet, even wounded, he didn't allow himself to become completely hardened. Deep down, he still believed that fate had something more to reveal. That night, after the bitter visit from his father, Laman tried to go on with his life, as if nothing had happened. He had dinner with his wife, talked about business, but his mind wasn't present. Buber's weary face, and more than anything, his words. "I gave you all I could, but what I needed most from you, I never received." Respect echoed in his memory like an unrelenting drumbeat. He tried to push the discomfort away, but the more he resisted, the stronger the memory became. Lying in his bed with expensive sheets, Lamin tossed and turned, restless. He remembered the past he'd spent his whole life trying to forget. He saw himself as a child again, sitting on his father's lap, listening to stories about courage and dignity. He remembered the nights when Ba worked late just to make sure he lacked nothing. He thought about the times his father went without new clothes, so he could buy books and school supplies for his son. Each memory came with a pang of guilt, as if the mansion's walls were beginning to close in around him. Noticing his silence, his wife asked cautiously, "Line, what did your father say to you today?" "You've been strange since you got back," he tried to avoid the question, but finally confessed in a low voice. "He just said that he gave me everything. Everything except the respect I never gave him." She sighed and looked at him seriously. "And isn't it true? Weren't you raised through his sacrifice? Didn't he give you an education with his sweat? Maybe you've forgotten where you came from." Those words hurt even more than his. Father's Laman stood and walked over to the mansion window, where he could see the city lights down below. Hidden in the shadows was the reality he refused to face. The hungry, the homeless girls like little Aminata, living a life he didn't want to acknowledge that. And then he remembered a scene from a few days before when he had driven through the city center. He had seen that same little girl he usually ignored sharing a piece of bread with the old man. At the time, he hadn't paid attention, but now that image haunted him. How could a girl with nothing offer kindness to a tired old man, while he, surrounded by luxury, denied even basic dignity to his own father? The memory struck him like a revelation. Laman felt ashamed, as if a mask had fallen from his face. He wasn't the successful man he claimed to be. He was hollow, a man propped up by appearances. All his money, all his social status meant nothing compared to the lack of humanity he had revealed. Unable to sleep, Laman wandered alone through the mansion. Every luxury around him felt like a mockery of his conscience. The expensive cars in the garage, the imported rugs, the artwork on the walls. Everything felt meaningless in the face of the pain he had caused the man who gave him life. For the first time in years, Laman cried. Not for anything he had lost, but for the deep regret he now carried. Meanwhile, across the city, Ba slept poorly, curled up on a street corner. But even in his pain, there was a dignity within him. A dignity Line was just beginning to recognize. The contrast was stark. The father, with nothing, still held on to his humanity. The son, with everything, had lost what mattered most. In the days that followed, Lamin could no longer look at this life the same way. He walked past his employees and remembered how his father, even as a boss, treated everyone with respect. He visited his businesses and recalled how young Buba once told him, "Money without honor builds nothing that lasts." Every detail of his routine was now pierced by his father's firm voice, louder now than ever before. The revelation didn't come with thunder. It came in silence, slowly eating away at them from the inside. Laman was beginning to realize that by rejecting his father, he had also rejected his own essence. And that awakening, painful though it was, would be the first step in a transformation that would change not only his life, but also the fate of everyone around him. The days that followed were heavy for Bawa. After facing the cold rejection of his son, he returned to the streets with his heart more crushed than ever. He walked, dragging his feet, feeling the weight of that rejection in every step. But fate, silent and relentless, once again led him to the square where he often found Aminata. There she was, sitting in the same corner with her cloth bag in her arms and a small hardened piece of bread in her hands. When she saw him approach, Aminata gave a discreet smile, but one full of light. There was no judgment, no awkwardness, just simple affection, something rare for those who lived in abandonment. The old man felt his legs tremble, not just from physical weakness, but from the emotion stirred by her welcome. He sat beside her and in silence let the tears fall. Aminata noticed the weight in his eyes. Without asking anything, she broke the bread and handed him half, just as she had before. "Airy, Grandpa. Today we have something to eat too." That gesture, small in the eyes of the world, was monumental to Ba. He felt as if that girl were an angel in disguise, someone sent to remind him that kindness still existed. He took the bread with trembling hands and said, barely finding his voice, "My child, you have no idea how much this means to me." Aminata, not fully grasping the depth of his words, simply smiled and replied, "It's nothing, Grandpa. If I have a piece, then you do too." In that moment, Booba realized that the girl, so small and with nothing, was offering him more than food. She was offering dignity, while his wealthy son refused to even acknowledge him as a father. A poor street girl treated him with respect and affection. The contrast was painful but also enlightening. That encounter with Aminata was like a spark inside Booba. He no longer saw the girl as just a street child. He saw in her a reminder of all that life had once taught him, and that pain had almost erased. He saw in her the generosity of his late wife. He saw in her the innocence Lami once had before being consumed by pride and vanity. Little by little, Bua began to share bits of his story with the girl, not with pride, but with the melancholy tone of someone who'd lived both joy and ruin. Aminata listened in silence, wide-eyed, as if hearing a real-life fable. To her, it didn't matter whether the old man had once been rich or powerful. What mattered was that he was someone who suffered like she did, and someone who needed company. This bond began to transform Booba for the first time in many years. He felt like he still had something to offer. He began guiding the girl, giving her advice, teaching Herald proverbs filled with the wisdom of the elders. Aminata listened with full attention as if she were storing up precious seeds. Between the two of them, an unlikely but deeply human connection was born. They weren't grandfather and granddaughter by blood, but they became family through affection. Meanwhile, back in his mansion, Lamine wrestled with memories that would not let him rest. His father's words and the image of the little girl sharing bread haunted his thoughts. The man who once saw Booba as nothing more than a burden now began to feel ashamed of his own cruelty. Day by day, the weight of his guilt grew until remorse slowly began to turn into a desire to make things right. Bubber's reunion with Aminata didn't just return hope to the old man. It became the key that began to awaken something in his son. It was as if the girl's kindness echoed far beyond the streets, crossing over high walls and reaching hardened hearts. The little beggar girl, without knowing it, was changing not just the life of a weary old man. She was also paving the way for the reconciliation of a family torn apart by arrogance. Booba began to realize that this girl was not just a companion in times of hunger. She was the bridge between past and future, between pain and healing, between rejection and forgiveness. Not end there. In the silence of the square, with the bread divided between their hands, a new certainty was born. Nothing would ever be the same again. Their union with Aminata didn't just give Boa a thread of hope. It reignited a purpose that had long been extinguished. For the first time in years, he no longer saw himself as just a man defeated by fate. The girl's gaze, the way she shared what little she had, awakened in him the sense that he still had something of value to give. Even without wealth, without a home, without a name, there was still in him the ability to offer something that could change someone's life. One morning, after a cold night of little sleep, Ba made a quiet decision. He looked at Aminata, curled up on the hard ground, clutching her cloth sack against her chest, and murmured to himself, "This girl can't live what I lived. I can't let her be lost to the streets." He knew he had no strength or resources on his own, but there were still people who respected him, even from a distance. Echoes of old friends or acquaintances who hadn't forgotten him completely. He decided to seek out one of them. Malin, a former business partner, now the director of a small community organization. Malin was surprised to see him again, but didn't close the door. With humility, Bub explained the girl's situation and made one request. "I asked nothing for myself. Malin, I've lived and I've lost. But that girl still has a future. Help her off the streets. Give her a chance." His words struck deep into Min's heart. He promised to find a solution to arrange a safe shelter for Aminata, a place where she could study and eat. And in that moment, Bubar realized his mission wasn't over. Life had brought him down, but it was still giving him the chance to save someone. Meanwhile, Lamine, the proud son, was beginning to break under the weight of his conscience. The silence of the nights had become unbearable, and the memory of his father haunted him like a shadow. Tired of running from the truth, he returned to the city, searching for the old man. He found him sitting beside Aminata in the square, and stood still, watching from a distance. He saw his father smile at the girl, saw the care in his expression, and for the first time felt true shame for everything he had said. Slowly, Lamin approached. When Booba looked up, father and son were face to face once again. The silence was heavy until Lamin, swallowing his pride, murmured, "Father, I was wrong." Ba didn't respond right away. His heart, though wounded, still had space for forgiveness. He looked at his son and didn't just see the arrogant man who once rejected him. He also saw the boy who once ran into his arms. With a steady voice, he said, "You didn't fail me, Lamin. You failed yourself. But if you're here now, maybe there's still time to make it right." Lamin lowered his head, emotional, and offered the help he had once refused. He said he was willing to care for his father, to give him whatever he needed to start over. But to everyone's surprise, Booba replied with calm, "I don't need luxury nor money. What I needed I've already found. Respect. The rest. If you wish to give it to the girl." Then he told his son Aminata's story. The girl who'd shared her only bread with him when no one else would. Hearing it, Lamin was deeply moved. The girl's humility clashed with the harshness of his own heart, and for the first time he extended his hand not just to his father but to the girl as well. And so the silent miracle happened. Booba, who had nothing left, offered his last bit of strength to change Aminata's fate. The son, once blind with pride, was transformed by the girl's simple gesture and the firm words of a father who had lost everything except his dignity. And the girl, who always believed that sharing was the only way to stay human, saw her life begin to change before her eyes. The old man felt he could leave in peace at any moment, because he was leaving behind something far greater than wealth. He was leaving the seed of a new future for the girl who called him Grandpa. The kindness he had received from Aminata had given him back the ability to love, to teach, and that silent exchange was enough to transform hardened hearts. The world didn't witness it with trumpets or applause. The miracle happened quietly between a forgotten old man, an abandoned girl, and a son finally waking up to the truth. And it was in that silence that a new story was born. A story made of forgiveness, dignity, and hope. The silence of the city in those early morning hours seemed to carry a different weight. It was no longer the silence of indifference, but a silence holding the depth of profound changes unfolding in hearts that not long ago had been hardened. Old Boo, who once walked hunched over by misery alone, now stood a little taller, not because his hunger had ended, but because he had regained something far greater, the dignity of being respected, of being called father, and of being treated as a human being by a girl who had nothing but her purity to give. With Lamin's support, now transformed by the weight of his remorse, Booba finally saw a new dream begin to take shape. Together, father and son decided to invest in a small community project to help girls living on the streets. It was a simple initiative, still modest, but full of meaning. Booba insisted that it be called Roots of Kindness in memory of Aminata's gesture, a reminder that even a seed planted in dry soil can blossom when nurtured with love. Limi, who had once measured the value of life in numbers and appearances, now saw the world through a different lens, compassion. Ash accompanied his father on visits to shelters and spoke with girls who had been forgotten by society. He discovered a new meaning for the word wealth. He realized his true triumph wasn't in the cars in his garage or the extravagant parties, but in every grateful look from a child who received food, shelter, and above all, respect. As for Amun, she no longer had to sleep on cold sidewalks. Thanks to Malin Bubber's old friend, she was finally given the care she had always deserved. She now had a simple mattress, a safe roof over her head, and perhaps most importantly, the chance to attend school for the first time in her life. She held a notebook in her hands and could draw her dreams on blank pages. And even though she was still young, she carried the wisdom of someone who had already learned that sharing the little you have can transform entire destinies. Watching the girl walk off to school each morning, felt that his life, once defined by loss, was now filled with new meaning. The cold nights, the years of rejection, the humiliation of being abandoned, all of it found its answer in that moment. He hadn't recovered his fortune, nor erased the lost years, but he had reconciled with his son. And more importantly, he had left behind something no one could take away, the proof that kindness survives even in the midst of misery. Transformed by guilt, and by the revelation of the girl's act, experienced something unfamiliar to him. The peace of reconnecting with his roots, he now walked beside his father. Not with shame or pride, but with respect and a desire to make things right. He discovered it was never too late to begin again. That life always offers new chances when the heart is open. And the greatest lesson of this whole story became clear not just to them but to everyone who came close to it. The generosity of a poor girl was enough to restore a broken man and awaken the conscience of an arrogant son. That was that simple gesture, breaking a piece of bread and offering it without hesitation. That proved love doesn't depend on wealth or status or blood. True love is revealed in small acts, and in them lies the strength to heal wounds that once seemed eternal. And so the old man and the son, once divided by pride and pain, were able to reconnect, not through money, but through truth and forgiveness. Aminata, the forgotten girl from the streets, found not only a home and a future, but the certainty that her kindness had meaning, and the entire community came to see in that unlikely union a living testimony that fate may be harsh, but it never abandons the just dot. The miracle wasn't announced with trumpets, nor written in the papers, but it was etched into the hearts of those who lived that transformation. And everyone who heard the story of Ambuband Lamine walked away with one lasting truth. The bread we share is never too little because it multiplies dignity, hope, and love. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our